Welcome to today's video where we will be discussing one of the most notorious traps in chess, the scholar's mate. If you're tired of falling for this quick checkmate, then you're in the right place because we'll be sharing with you some valuable tips and strategies on how to brutally punish this aggressive opening and gain the upper hand from the very start. So sit back, grab your chessboard and let's get started. The scholar's mate usually starts off with the moves e4, e5 and white will play a very aggressive second move, queen to h5. The whole idea of this queen to h5 move is white will now threaten to capture our pawn on e5 with check, and it also sets up the 4-move checkmate with queen takes f7 after white plays bishop c4 on the next move. So let's take a look at some few moves that you have to be very careful of as black. Many beginners who don't know how to defend against this line, they might play a move like pawn to g6, trying to attack the white queen. However, this is a serious blunder because white can now just play queen takes e5 check and he will win our rook on the next move. So, for example, we're forced to block with a piece and white will just capture our rook and it's already game over in just 4 moves because we're already a whole rook down. Besides that, you might play a move like knight to f6, trying to threaten the queen and kick it away. However, this is also a tiny mistake because white can just capture our pawn on e5 with check and white will just gain a pawn for free. So in many cases, we will play knight to c6 to defend our pawn on e5, and knight to c6 is also the best move in this position. White will continue with bishop to c4, which is the scholar's mate or known as the 4-move checkmate as well because white is threatening to checkmate on f7 on the next move. So all you have to do is to defend against the threats of your opponent. So the threat here is very clear. White wants to capture our f7 pawn with the queen on the next move. So all we have to do is either to block the queen from capturing our pawn or to defend our pawn on f7 with another piece. Most beginners will make the mistake of playing knight to f6, trying to capture the queen, but this is just a blunder because you blunder checkmate in 1 move. So instead of playing knight to f6, you could play queen to e7 or queen to f6 because both queen moves protects the pawn on f7. However, in this video, we will not be recommending either one of these queen moves because even though you can play them in a real game, the queen on f6 in this position kinda blocks our knight from natural development. Same thing with playing queen to e7, it also blocks our bishop from developing in the future. So which is why we'll be recommending the best move in this position, which is to play pawn to g6. So now the pawn attacks the queen and it blocks the threat of queen to f7. However, white can still try to give checkmate by retreating the queen back to f3. So now again, the threat is to capture on f7 and we just have to either block the threat or protect the f7 square. Just be very careful not to play a careless move like knight to d4 because even though it looks good because the knight threatens the queen and we also threaten to give check on the king and winning the rook on a1 with a fork. But just be careful that our f7 is still under attack. So all we have to do now, we develop our knight naturally with knight to f6 and we just block the threat with queen to f7. So now here, white has to stop our threat of knight to d4 on the next move because it's very strong. And the best way for white to do so is to either play knight to e2 or pawn to c3, both defending the d4 square. And this opening is by no means a beginner level opening because even top grandmasters like Nakamura and the world champion Carlsen has played this opening before as white. However, for lower elo players, they might be looking to find an opening which gives them a quick win, and there are still several traps and cheap tricks or tactics that they might use to try and gain a quick win. So before we take a look at the 2 main moves, let's first look at what if white plays a move like pawn to g4. We'll call this cheap trick line number 1 because now white is threatening to play pawn to g5 and if we move our knight, so for example, let's say we play a move like bishop to g7, now he pushes up his pawn to g5, attacking our knight. If we move our knight anywhere, now white captures our pawn on f7, and that is checkmate. So just be very careful with this pawn move, and actually the pawn move is not sound at all, because now we can launch our counter attack on the white's position. We play knight to d4 here because our knight attacks the queen, and we also threaten to capture on c2 on the next move as mentioned earlier. Don't worry, as white has no threats on us. He cannot play queen takes f6 because our knight is defended by our own queen. So now white has to deal with the threat of knight captures on c2. He can play either queen to d3 or queen to d1 in this position. If he plays queen to d3, we can just capture the pawn on g4 with our knight. So let's say he plays a move like queen to d1, retreating the queen and also defending the pawn on c2. Now obviously we can capture the pawn on e4 as well, but since this video is all about brutally punishing our opponent, we play a very aggressive move with pawn to d5. The whole idea with this pawn now is we gain a tempo by pushing up our pawn because we attack the bishop, and if white captures our pawn, now we free up our own bishop to capture the pawn on g4 this way. So now the queen is under attack and white has three choices to defend. He can play knight to e2 to block, bishop to e2 to block, or pawn to f3, blocking our bishop and also threatening to capture our bishop. So first, let's take a look at what if white plays knight to e2. This is actually already a blunder because now we have checkmate in two moves. All we have to do is play knight to f3 check. The king is forced to go here, and we have a really nice checkmate with bishop to h3, checkmate with just two of our pieces, the bishop and the knight. So white cannot defend with the knight. So let's take a look at what if he defends with the bishop. Now all we have to do is just to capture the bishop first because our own bishop is under attack. We capture the bishop, knight captures, and now we have a really strong move with queen takes d5. Our queen attacks the rook, and also we are threatening to give check with knight to f3 on the next move. So we go back to this position and we have to discuss the third move, which is pawn to f3, blocking our bishop and also threatening to capture our bishop on the next move. But now we do not have to be afraid and we do not have to retreat our bishop because again we want to punish our opponent by bringing his queen out earlier on so many moves, and we play knight to e4. At first glance, this move might seem as a blunder because not only we did not retreat our bishop, white cannot. We are voluntarily bringing in our knight to be forked by his pawn on f3. But if you take a closer look at this position, white cannot capture our knight because his queen is in pin. And the whole idea of this knight move is because now we free up our queen to bring in our queen to h4 check and to give checkmate on the next move. So if white plays a move like pawn takes our bishop, we just play queen to h4 check and it's already checkmate on the next move with queen to f2. So the key thing to remember when your opponent tries to go for the scholar's mate or the 4-move checkmate is you need to feel angry because your opponent is trying to do a cheap trick against and try to checkmate you in 4 moves. So as long as you know how to defend against those threats, you can feel angry because your opponent just wants a quick win, and we need to play aggressive moves to counter and punish our opponent. So we have seen what if white plays pawn to g4, trying to continue his attack, and white has one more move, which is queen to b3, again having this double bishop and queen battery to attack our pawn on f7. But before we continue, if you're finding these tips and strategies helpful, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support enables us to continue creating great chess content for you. So now let's take a look at what to do after white plays queen to b3, trying to continue his attack again. But now the key difference is white's bishop is in front of his queen. So even though white is able to capture our pawn on f7 with check, it is not checkmate because our king can still move forward. So in this variation, knight to d4 here is actually the best move because again we hit the queen and we're threatening to the pawn on c2 as well if white captures our pawn on f7, this is actually quite bad for him because we are able to play king to e7. At first glance it might look dangerous for us, but don't worry, because if you take a closer look, the white queen is now under attack from our knight, and he has to defend the bishop on f7 with the queen, because for example, if he plays a move like queen to b4 check, we can just capture the bishop already. So white has to play queen to c4, the only move where he can try to hang on to this bishop, because queen to d5 is impossible as our knight protects the square. Now we just have to attack this queen with our pieces with a move like pawn to d5, trying to deflect the queen away from the defense of the bishop. And as you guys can see, white has no more queen moves along this diagonal that is possible for him to defend the bishop. So if he plays a move like queen to c5 check here, we just capture the bishop on f7 and we are already up a piece. Also, our bishop now hits the queen, and if he plays a move like queen takes e5, trying to capture back our pawn, we can just take on c2, giving the check and forking the rook on a1. So this is how to defend against cheap tricks and tactics that lower rated opponents might try to use against you. Just remember, all we have to do is to protect our f7 square or protect any other incoming threats that white is trying to make, and then we can launch counter attack and punish our opponent from doing so. So now we have to discuss the two best moves as mentioned in the intro for white, which is knight to e2 or pawn to c3. So let's first take a look at what if white plays knight to e2. The idea is very simple. He just wants to defend the d4 square to prevent us from jumping our knight in, and it also develops a piece for white because he can look to castle on the next move. So here we just play bishop to g7, normal development, and now white might try to continue his attack by playing a move like pawn to d3, bringing up his bishop to g5, and later on bringing up his knight this way with knight to c3 and knight to d5, trying to put pressure with this pin on the knight with our queen. But don't worry, because all we have to do is just castle, continue our development. If white plays a move like bishop to g5, trying to utilize this pin, and later on bringing his knight up to attack us, now we just have to play pawn to h6, kicking away the bishop. White will most likely retreat the bishop back one move because he still wants to put pressure with this pin, and now we play the move pawn to g5. This might seem as a weakening move because we just played two pawn moves and exposed our king side by a bit. But don't worry, because our pawn moves are really strong as white is forced to retreat his bishop this way, and if you guys can see, the bishop actually has no more forward moves. The bishop can never capture our pawn on e5 because our knight protects it. And now here we play an aggressive move to punish this white setup with pawn to d5. The whole idea of this move is, again, we gain a tempo to attack the bishop, and later on we're looking to bring our own bishop up to g4, trying to trap the queen. So here white will most likely capture our pawn, and now we actually have two different ways to win, and we'll show both of the variations. The first line is actually to play knight to b4. Now our knight threatens to capture the pawn on c2, so white will most likely retreat the bishop to defend the pawn on c2. Now we capture back the pawn on d5 with our knight, and on the next move we're actually looking to play bishop to g4, trapping the queen, because our knight on d5 covers this square, our bishop attacks the queen, and our knight on f6 covers this square as well, so the queen has nowhere to go. If white plays a move like pawn to h3, thinking that he's actually safe because now we cannot play our bishop to g4 attacking his queen, but now because we already marched our pawn forward previously, now we have this aggressive move pawn to g4, and actually the queen is already trapped. The queen has no moves to go, and although white can capture our pawn, now we just capture back with our bishop, and it's an easy win for us because the queen is trapped. So that's the first method to win with knight to b4. Now let's take a look at the second method, which might be more flashy and more powerful, which is bishop to g4 immediately. So here the queen is not trapped yet because he can play queen to e3, and now the key move here to remember is to play knight to d4. Our knight attacks his knight on e2, it also threatens to capture on c2, the usual check on the king and forking the rook on a1. So white can capture our knight on d4. We capture back with the pawn, queen takes, and it might seem that we just gave away 2 pawns for nothing. But in this position, as you guys can see from the evaluation bar, black is clearly winning. Black is clearly and easily winning because now we have the move rook to e8 check. The whole idea being we have developed most of our pieces and we have also safely castled our king. Whereas now white is in check, he cannot castle king side. His pieces, his knight and rook on the queen side is still undeveloped, and white's pieces are just not coordinated at all. So here if he plays a move like king to d2, he has only 2 options, either king d2 or king to f1, because our bishop is covering these squares as well. So if he plays king to d2, now we just play knight to e4 check, discovered check, winning the queen on the next move. So if he tries to hide the king in a corner to the left side, now we play bishop to e2 check. He has to play king to g1, otherwise if his king goes back, our bishop can just give more discovered checks. Now, a really nice move where we actually trap the queen already is to play knight to d7. So again, the queen has no moves. Our bishop attacks the queen, our knight covers this square, and the queen has no possible moves to escape. And we easily win the queen and this position. So lastly, all we have left is just to cover the second best white move, which is pawn to c3 to protect the square on d4 as well. Again, we just develop our pieces with the bishop and castling on the next move. White can still do the same threats, trying to play pawn to d3 and bringing his bishop out on the next move. So after castle, bishop to g5. Again, we have no reason to fear pushing up our kingside pawns to attack the white's bishop. And after retreating the bishop, again we play pawn to d5 with the same idea to gain a tempo attacking his bishop and to bring our own bishop out to g4 to attack his queen. And after pawn takes, the key difference and the only difference now is we do not have moves like knight to d4 or knight to b4 because of this pawn move covering both the squares. But don't worry, because now we play bishop to g4, similar with the previous variation. The only move for white here is to play queen to e3, and we just capture back the pawn on d5, attacking the queen as well. White will most likely capture our knight with his bishop, because if he plays a move like queen to d2 back, now we just play our knight to f4. Our knight gains a very strong outpost on f4, threatening to capture on g2 and also putting pressure on the d3 pawn. If white captures our knight, we just have to capture back our pawn this way, and this opens up lots of diagonals for us, and white is already in trouble because we are going to play rook e8 check on the next move, utilizing the e file, and our bishop on g7 is also really strong with this, like a sniper on this diagonal. So white will most likely capture our knight here on d5. We capture back with our queen, and now our queen is threatening to capture the pawn on g2. If let's say white plays a move like knight to f3, trying to block and protect the pawn on g2 while developing his own piece, now we have a really strong move with pawn to f5, threatening to play pawn to f4, forking the queen and also trapping the bishop on g3. Again, our aggressive pawn moves from the start with h6 and g5 now has paid off because the bishop is trapped on g3 with nowhere to go. We do not have to worry about this diagonal anymore because white has already traded off his light square bishop for our knight on d5 earlier on, so there's no threats of pins or checks along this line. So if white plays a move like h3, trying to attack our bishop and also gaining a tempo, trying to retreat his bishop this way on h2, but it doesn't work out for him because first we play pawn to f4, attacking his queen and his bishop. If the queen retreats this way, now we just capture the knight, attacking the queen, gaining a tempo. He captures, offering a queen trade. We just have to trade queens, capture, and now we take the bishop and we are one piece up, and we also have this nice f-file for future attacks, and it's a quite easy position for black to play. And that's it for our video on how to brutally punish the scholar's mate. We've shared some valuable tips and strategies that will help you turn the tables and dominate your opponent. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more chess content like this. In the comments below, let us know if you have ever fallen victim to the scholar's mate and if you feel more confident in your ability to defend against the scholar's checkmate after watching this video. So thanks for watching, and we see you in the next video.